Okay, well, I'm just going to dive into some case reports. I'm hoping to try to get a couple of things across. First of all is that autism is just a behavioral phenotype, meaning that what it has in common is there are certain things such as language and social ability, which are decreased, but on the biological level, it's far more complex. And that just saying that your child has autism just is not much more helpful in many ways than saying your child has special needs, in that there are many causes of autism, and to treat autism, to improve it, you need to know what the cause is in your child. And the second one is to try to get across the idea that though not every case can figure it out, a lot of them can, and when you can figure out the problem, a lot of times you can make a difference. So I'm going to use sort of a case report model here and show you patients that I've actually have been involved with and how that we went about doing it. So the first one here is 𝘂𝗵𝗲, and as autism goes, he's relatively uncomplicated. There's far more complicated cases that I will get to. He was diagnosed with autism at 18 months. He had unexplained vomiting following an MMR vaccination at age 15 months. And then he had his symptoms started from then. His hypotonia, which is very common in this. He has some mental health issues, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, irritability, aggression. And then he has what I call functional disease issues. And functional disease is not a great name, but if anyone has a better name, I'd love to see it changed. What I mean by this is the function of the cells, the tissues, the organ systems. It's not the structure. So he had constipation, fatigue, sleep problems, and night twitches. And so overall, this is a fairly typical case. So we did the DNA testing, which at that point was, like in the dark ages 5 years ago. And we could only sequence 1,000 genes and found that he had a variant in the creatine transporter. Now, this is a gene that's actually very well described in neurodevelopmental disorders, not just in autism, but in intellectual disability and in epilepsy and in many other of the neurodevelopmental disorders. Creatine, as you might know about creatine from bodybuilders. They take creatine to get more strength. It makes the muscles larger. Well, creatine is sort of a battery for energy that cells can use and draw from when they need it. Actually, if you have a problem with making creatine, you have more of a neurological issue because the brain requires more energy than anything else in the body. And when you have a creatine disorder, you generally get intellectual problems. Now, the creatine transporter is on the X chromosome. So boys only have 1 copy, girls have 2 copies. So it usually, but not exclusively, causes trouble in males. And again, like any of these disorders, another thing I want to get across is that the genes don't cause disease. They change the way in which the body works, and then that, if there's enough problems, that can contribute to disease. We'll get to that. But you can see the stars here. This is actually a printout of the old 𝘁𝗫𝗏 report, a laboratory that no longer exists. But this is, I just copied and pasted from the, I guess this is not going to work, huh? Oh, it's so dim, I can see it myself. But anyway, all the stars, they're matched up very well. We tried creatine, but creatine didn't work, as it often doesn't work, because if the creatine transporter is not working, more creatine isn't necessarily going to get into the brain. But then the father, who's a physician, did a lot of research on this, and he tried cyclocreatine, which is actually in some energy drinks. And cyclocreatine goes to the brain, forms creatine, but it doesn't go across it doesn't use the transporter, it goes directly in. And you can see that he got a lot better on cyclocreatine. And his improvements went away when he was off of cyclocreatine, and then they got better when he went back on it again. So this is an example of finding an exact contributing factor for autism in a patient. and in which you treat the patient, you get improvement in core autistic areas. So this patient's social and language development did improve on cyclocreatine. Here's another patient. She's in her 30s now, but she presented to me as a teenager. She has autism, but she is a high-functioning autism. I'm going to show you her artwork on my slides throughout the presentation. I have the originals in my office. This is this is one of the artworks that she did, a self-portrait. And while she is very gifted, she will not speak to anybody at all, ever. She's fully capable of speaking, but she does not want to speak, and so she uses a computer with Siri's voice on it. So she's very fast at typing, and so Siri's voice comes out in full sentences. And but she also has a lot of functional problems, pain, fatigue, GI issues. In fact, the main issue was continuous migraine that she had for multiple years. She also has some depression and anxiety. And then biochemical testing, as it often does from what Dr. Fry's lecture, biochemical testing showed that there is signs of a mitochondrial dysfunction, that her mitochondria did not seem to be working very well, and she was put on a mitochondrial cocktail. I'm going to get to really what the meat of the cocktail is, but those are what she was put on, some of the more common things. Molecular testing later found that she had 2 mutations in the glutamase 2 enzyme, which changes the amino acid glutamine to glutamate. And because glutamate goes to alpha-ketoglutarate in the Krebs cycle, which is a main part of the energetics of the mitochondria, I figured the problem is that she doesn't have enough Krebs cycle activity, and I gave her alpha-ketoglutarate. And then since then, we've increased it several times. And then it may be hard to read that, but at the bottom is a direct quote that the mother emailed me, and that the alpha-ketoglutarate did make a significant difference in her, and that she not only had a lot less of the functional symptomatology, but her anxiety, her autistic features had decreased to the point that she wanted to leave the house, and she wanted to go meet other young adults and to display her artwork at shows and things. So that she would beforehand, she would never come out except to go to doctor's offices. So this is another example of where you can find the exact, I won't want to use cause, it's contributing factors, because people are more than just their mutation. There's 3 billion nucleotides in the genome, plus there's environment. And so even when there is a genetic abnormality, it doesn't completely define who you are, but it contributes to who you are. So if you have a genetic contribution to disease and you can treat that, it can make a big difference. So, who am I? I am many different people at the same time. So I wear many different hats. I self-identify as a physician in the last 30 years, as most of what I've done, most of my time right now is taking care of patients. But I have been, and still are, many other people. I was at Children's Hospital. I was a faculty at USC, University of Southern California, for 20 years. I had a laboratory at one time. I even had grant support and everything to do that. And I still write some papers now. I am the medical and scientific director of NeuroNeeds, which is a company to try to make nutritional products to try to treat some of these genetic abnormalities that we're finding on testing. I also do a lot of expert legal cases, including in vaccine court, and also for, unfortunately, Munchausen by proxy medical child abuse is not that unheard of in this situation. And I do a lot of telemedicine as well. It's not just in my office. So the one thing I mentioned there is I have been the medical director of DNA testing companies. Cortigen, when it was in existence, I was the medical director. I was for Lineagen for a while and 2 other labs. So I have experience in this in terms of working in a company trying to push the needle forward on making genetic testing available to understand and treat these disorders. And then here's some caveats. Again, as Dr. Fry mentioned, it's the FDA has not approved medication for use in autism, any core autism functions. This is personalized medicine. It's an N of 1. I find a group of mutations in an individual that's a unique individual. Even a sibling of that person is going to have different mutations because they may have some of the ones that are the same, but some of them are different. So everyone's a unique individual with a unique genetic endowment, and I try to take that and try to treat that as best as possible. Obviously, there's not a lot of studies that have been done based upon that information. There's none. There's just a patient in front of me, the family, and we try to do our best. And also, I'm going to be talking a lot about nutritional support. I'm much a believer on that, despite an MD, and that nutrition is extremely important, and particularly in autism, and I've been doing nutritional support for over 25 years in patients with autism, and because I'm a strong believer in that is one of the reasons I started a company in that. That's Kelly's artwork again. And that's my favorite one of hers. She's getting much better as an artist. She's always was good, but this is the last one I have from her. So what is autism? I mean, that's a big question. And until very recently, we really didn't know. But we do now. Idiopathic is one of those terms that they throw at medical students that you have to learn. You know what idiopathic is? It means that the doctor said idiot and the patient's pathetic. In medical terms, it means that we don't know what it is. Basically the same. Autism's not, you'll still find people will say that, and there'll be textbooks on that. Autism is no longer idiopathic. We don't know everything about it by any means, but we really understand what autism is at this point. And there are thousands of different genes that have been associated with autism. And it's not, where the complexity goes away is that it affects the long chains in the brain, the wires, the cables that connect the different parts of the brain, the gray matter, to each other. If there is a genetic abnormality which affects that more than others, and there's the key there, it's more than others. Then you really get an autistic phenotype. So while nobody can really describe, there's official criteria for it. What is autism? It's sort of, when you see it, and you've seen it 100 times, 1,000 times, you know it when you see it, even if it's hard to describe it. And what that is when the behavioral, and particularly the social and the language components, are reduced compared to what you'd expect based upon the IQ. So I know that's a typical concept, but let me try to explain it a little bit. There are many patients, like Kelly, who are very intelligent, but are autistic. And they're called high functional autism. We used to call them Asperger before it came out that Dr. Asperger was a Nazi, so we don't call it that anymore. But you know what I'm talking about, high functioning autism. So they have social deficits and language deficits. And in many of those cases, their social and language deficits are actually, they're in the normal range. But their IQs are so sky high that they have a relative deficit, so they seem kind of quirky. On the other hand, you can have people that have very severe intellectual problems, that have very severe intellectual disability, or what used to be called mental retardation. But their language and their social deficits are even further behind. So we can call that autism too. So it's really a basis of the relative deficits in those areas. And there are others, but two different pathways in the brain which require connections between many different parts of the brain are social and language. They require connections all over the brain. And when those are decreased, then you can get sort of an autistic phenotype. And it is more complex, but that's really kind of boiling it down to the situation. The other thing you need to know is that genes do not cause disease. There's not an autism gene. There's not a gene for any disease. The genes are there to help the body, to help the brain, to help the organism to survive, to reproduce. And if there is a change, a variant in that gene, it may do nothing. It may help the individual. It may hinder the individual. But all of us have mutations. All of us have different genetics, or we'd all look exactly the same. We'd all be identical twins of each other. And some variants will increase the likelihood of disease, and some variants will decrease the likelihood of disease. But if you have enough variants and they interact in a certain way, then you're more likely to get disease. And they interact with environment as well. So when I'm talking about mutations, many times these mutations came from a parent who may have no disease at all, or very mild disease, or a completely different disease. Because what the mutation isn't causing the disease. The mutation is causing a disruption in the homeostasis from which the organism will try to amend, to try to fix. And if you have enough mutations and enough environmental insults, which are important on that, then you can end up with disease. And so that, if you say, well, why do all these people have all these different things? It's because of the complexity of the brain. All right, this is the most complex slide I'm going to show. And the reason to show this slide is actually to give hope, is that this is, back in 2016, so actually there's been a lot of work since then. But these are different pathways which are involved in autism. And I know it's hard to read the slide. The main reason I'm showing the slide is I put the blue arrows there. Those are treatable pathways. I wanted to show you that the pathways are huge and they involve many different genes. Some of these pathways include hundreds or even thousands of genes. But these are the main pathways which are involved in autism as of that particular study in 2016. There's a lot of stuff I can put on this, a lot of other pathways that aren't on that slide that I could add on to it. But of all of the pathways on the slide, you can see that the ones that are treatable are even more than half of them. So while the autism is genetic, in fact, of all the common disorders, is considered to be the most genetic, meaning that there's more genetic and less environmental components. It doesn't mean there's not environmental components, and it doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. Many of these pathways are treatable, and it really does work. I've shown you a couple of examples so far. Here's another example. Luca has autism, developmental delay, and epilepsy, which is a common combination. Most people with autism, but certainly not all, have intellectual disability. Some are normal or even advanced in intelligence, but more than half have intellectual disability. And 1/3 of individuals with autism have epilepsy. This is a really common combination. And he has we don't know the exact genetics yet. He has an inherited mutation in sodium channel 1A channels. But he probably has many different mutations from the mother and the father, but this is to show you that he does have a mitochondrial dysfunction as part of the testing, some of the things that Dr. Fry had been mentioning. Again, not uncommon, because a lot of kids with autism have mitochondrial dysfunction. He was put on a mitochondrial cocktail and he improved. You all know your metabolic pathways, right? Yes. Krebs cycle in the middle there. There's a circle in the middle. If I had a pointer, I'd show it. I'm just trying to show you that, there are about 1,000 enzymes that are involved in the center aspects of metabolism, and all of those can be involved in, in different diseases. A lot of them are involved in autism, but metabolism is only one of the aspects in autism. So nutrition really revolves around metabolism. And this is a lecture on nutrition. And well, first of all, is that there are many different, mostly from other countries, but there have been many different studies that have looked at people with autism, mostly children, but some adults, and what are the deficient minerals and vitamins. And these are the ones that they've been studied. Some of these are in blood, a lot of them are in hair, because hair doesn't say just what you had at the last meal, hair is saying what you've had over the last few months. And so these are the vitamins and minerals and other nutrients that have been published to be decreased in autism. The green is my emphasis. The green are the ones that I think are the key involvements. And I'm going to go over those individually, but the green are like the main ones here. So you can see that there's been quite a few things in autism which have been shown to be deficient. However, the main reason for nutritional therapy is not to correct a deficiency. I know a lot of kids with autism have very unusual, quirky patterns of eating, and they may very well have nutritional deficits. And that's important to correct. But the main reason for nutrition is not to correct that. If your child is on an absolutely perfect diet, there are still reasons to give nutrition. And that's if you can push metabolic pathways in the direction that we want them to go by giving incredibly large amounts of key nutrients. If you want to know which metabolic pathways, those. A lot of them. Okay, a mitochondrial cocktail. So Dr. Fry had mentioned about mitochondria a lot. You go to 20 different mitochondrial doctors, you'll get 40 different mitochondrial cocktails. Everybody has a different idea as to what's a mitochondrial cocktail. The ones I put on this slide are the ones I think are probably the most common or key involvements of the mitochondrial cocktail. What they just are is they're all natural vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, cofactors, etc. They're just chemicals which you need for good nutrition that are not themselves burnt for calories, so they're not carbohydrates or protein. And so those are some of the ones there. And when you talk about cocktail, doesn't mean there's alcohol in it. Because alcohol is actually a mitotoxin. But the cocktail means many things mixed together. But what I'm going to talk about here are 8 different ones. I'm not to say by any means that there's no evidence for other nutrients, but I'm going to show you 8 that I think there's good evidence that are helpful in autism, and that in my clinical experience makes a difference. Dr. Rosignol, you've heard his name a few times here. He gives a similar lecture, and he's picked a different 8 or so. There's an overlap, but they're not complete between the groups. Of those 8, 7 of them are mitochondrial cocktail, the omega-3 fatty acids being an exception. So the first one here is carnitine. Carnitine is probably the first one that we recognize. Carnitine's been used in metabolic disease for a generation or two, and it's been used in autism for more than a generation. Acetylcarnitine is just carnitine with an acetyl group on it. It's a complex slide, and I do hope that everyone gets access to the slides so you don't have to read them quickly and memorize or take pictures of it and everything. But there's a couple caveats I want to mention. Number one is that there are studies on carnitine, that there is an improvement on carnitine. Many of those individuals probably do have mitochondrial dysfunction. That's probably why they get better. And carnitine, what it really is it's a ferry, and it ferries fats, long-chain fats, into the mitochondria where they're burned for energy. But carnitine also has another role to take unburned material out of a mitochondria that's not working right, sort of the sludge, the smoke, if you will, the pollution, and get it out of the mitochondria so it can be excreted. And so it has a detoxifying effect. And when we use huge doses of carnitine, we're generally using it to detoxify as well. And the other thing I want to mention is I know that there's been hype lately about carnitine might increase heart disease, and some people are concerned about that. Some doctors are not using it anymore. I use it when carnitine levels are low or on the low side of the normal range. In my personal experience, if carnitines are high or on the high side of the normal range, you don't get any additional benefit out of it. And when they're very high, then there's a theoretical risk of heart disease. So I get blood levels, and I use carnitine supplementation to get the levels onto the higher side of the normal range. And I don't give huge amounts to push them much higher. And I feel that patients do generally do better on carnitine. It has very few side effects. It can make you smell like fish, but that can be dealt with. You can use riboflavin, you can use lower doses. When my patients have that, I get rid of it. CoQ. CoQ is personally my favorite. I think it's by itself makes a huge difference. And if you have everything else perfect and you don't use CoQ, I don't think you're getting nearly as much improvement as you can get. It's called coenzyme Q10, is its long name. It's also called ubiquinone. You can find those names somewhere on there if you have good eyesight. And it is used to ferry electrons across the complexes. To go from complex 1 to complex 3, you need CoQ. To go from complex 2 to complex 3, you need CoQ. It's also a great antioxidant, which removes oxidative metabolites, which is, again, a detoxifying effect. So like carnitine, it's helpful in making energy and in detoxifying a mitochondria that's not working quite so well. The problem with CoQ is that if you go to the store and you buy coenzyme Q10, it's almost all completely useless. You can take all the CoQ in the bottle and your blood levels will hardly go up at all. There's some brands are much better than others. Personally, I think that ubiquinone, which is the main part of CoQ, which is on almost all of the stores, you really have to give huge amounts. And for 20 years, I was giving huge amounts of ubiquinone to my patients to try to get their blood levels up. Now I use ubiquinol. The only difference is in the last letter. It's an L instead of an NE. It looks almost exactly the same. I use ubiquinol. It is 5 times more bioavailable. It means you can use 5 times less of the dose to get the same blood levels. I use high doses of ubiquinol in my patients, and the blood levels come up very nicely. Patients get a lot better. A lot of times, that's all that you need to get rid of pain and chronic fatigue and some other issues. Ubiquinol by itself will often help a lot. Caveat, blood levels. The same dose of CoQ that in one person is sky high hardly moves up at all in another person. The dose I give to people is I start at 200 milligrams twice a day, unless you're like below kindergarten age, and then it'll be less. But if you're first grade or over, I give 200 milligrams in the morning and 200 milligrams in the evening. And then I get a blood level a week or 2 weeks later. Most of the time it's low, but I can tell how much to give based on how it is. And you get another blood level. I'd say my average patient is on around 800 a day. But I mean, some of them do well on 400. Some of them are on 2,000 or more. So getting the CoQ level is really an important thing, and the blood levels are important. The other thing I want to say about CoQ is that in my experience, I like the blood levels to be really high, like higher than 4. Normal is up to 1.4, but I like the levels to be high. I said 3 to 4 here. I like, I prefer it to be higher than 4. So 4 to 7 is my perfect range. And so a lot of times I'll get a panic level from a laboratory, and it'll say that it's 2.5 because that's like twice normal. And I'll say, nope, not nearly high enough yet. Got to go up higher. It does make a difference in my experience. For heart disease, they generally recommend more higher than 3. So it's in the same ballpark. Magnesium. Magnesium is used for many different things. It's great for headache. It's great for constipation. It's used for many things. It's one of the key involvements in autism is magnesium. Magnesium comes in many different forms. If it doesn't say on the bottle, it's magnesium oxide, which is not very bioavailable. Oh, one thing, if the CoQ just says CoQ, it doesn't say ubiquinone or ubiquinol, it's the cheap one, because the more expensive one costs 10 times as much to make, so, or at least to buy. So if it doesn't say the magnesium on it, it's the cheap one, oxide. It's a general rule. People sometimes use glycinate, which is glycine in it, amino acids. Sometimes use citrate. Citrate's great if you have constipation. Malate's another good one. Every doctor has their own favorite magnesium. Basically, there's 3 things about it, is that some of them are bigger than others, so you need to swallow larger tablets. Some of them cause diarrhea, like citrate, but a lot of kids have constipation. That's great. They can have normal bowels. And then there's bioavailability. Some of them are absorbed better than others. I tend to use glycinate, citrate, and malate, as I think are probably the best ones, but there are many other ones out there that people will use. Magnesium uses it does too many things for me to explain what magnesium does. It's involved in thousands of different processes in life. And it's very key in energy metabolism. Vitamin B6. Has many different complex names on it. B6 has been shown to be helpful in autism. I'm not going to say very much about it except for the fact that B6 has an activated form, and most of the vitamins you get in the store are inactivated, which are not as useful. Only the specialty vitamins will have activated B6, which may or may not be better depending on your genetics. Folate. There's so much talked about folate. Folate is like a religion. Folate has an activated form, which is methylated. You can add up to 4 methyl groups. Fully methylated is tetra methyl hydrofolate. There's also folinate. Folinate is similar to folate, but it crosses the blood-brain barrier without the transporter. And since a lot of kids with autism have problems with folate transport, I think you're going to talk about that again? Okay, I won't go into that. Folate and folinate are important, and Dr. Fry will talk about it more. Again, there's many different types of folate. So when you get a product or something, you need to know what you're doing. B12. There are many different forms of B12. There's activated and inactivated forms. Some practitioners use injections of B12 to give huge amounts. I tend not to do that, but I'm not against it. I tend to use large amounts of bioavailable that are given by mouth. But B12, there's a fair amount of evidence that B12 is useful. Vitamin D3, probably didn't think, most people don't think of it as an autism vitamin or as something in the mitochondrial cocktail, but vitamin D is used for more than just bone density. It does that. Vitamin D does a lot of things, including it's involved in the mitochondria and it's part of the cocktail. And you really don't know if you have enough vitamin D until you get a level. It's a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level to make sure that you have enough vitamin D. Some of the studies on vitamin D have shown that levels higher than 40 are good for autism. Less than 20 is considered deficiency, and 20 to 30 is considered borderline. So I like to push it higher than 30 at least. It's better, and if it's higher than 40. Omega-3 fatty acids. This is an exception in that it is in an oil form, which is somewhat different than some of the others. And it's hard to put into some products. It's usually given as a separate one. It's hard to put it in a product that has everything in it because it's an oil. It doesn't really mix with powders. But there's some studies that have shown that omega-3s are good. And then there's many different names of the omega-3s. They're high in fish, but it's not from the fish. The fish eat the plankton. And that's where they get it from. So as a farmed fish, you're not going to get the omega-3s. And then I just want to mention that, I mean, like I said, that there's activation. A lot of these vitamins are activated, like CoQ is activated in the ubiquinol form, and then B6, B9, which is folate, and B12 all have activated forms, so that your vitamin that you got over the counter may or may not be activated. It probably isn't. Here's Big Zach here. It's another case report I want to talk about. Big Zach has autism and had severe intellectual disability, but he also had a lot of issues. He had cyclic vomiting syndrome, which you've heard about Kristen Dane has. Cyclic vomiting syndrome is having episodes of vomiting and nausea and lethargy, and then episodes in which you don't have that, or much reduced nausea. And so he would, for a week, he would be vomiting in the hospital with an IV, and then for 3 weeks, he would not be vomiting, and then he'd vomit for a week. So he had like tremendous number of hospitalizations for years on that. He had multiple hospitalizations where his bowels would not just work at all. He needed cleanouts. But his major problem was complex regional pain syndrome. When I first met him, his right foot was a little swollen, a little purple, but it was so painful he couldn't wear a sock. If you just touched it, he would scream. He could not bear weight on it. So he was in a wheelchair and he couldn't touch his foot at all. And he was on 3 different narcotics and he was still in a lot of pain. So I put him on the mitochondrial cocktail. At that time, it was just CoQ and carnitine. That was a long time ago, and also amitriptyline, which is helpful in pain syndromes. And all of those problems went away. His complex regional pain syndrome went away completely, so he was able to walk and run and off narcotics completely. His cyclic vomiting went away. He went from having 25 hospitalizations a year to less than 2 hospitalizations a year. So it made a big difference. Later, we figured out the genetic issue on him. It was a cholinergic receptor. I think I'll get to that in the next talk on genetic testing. Okay, little break here. It's really beautiful here in Vancouver. You might not think that the desert where I come from is all that great, but sometimes it is. This is the super bloom in the Mojave Desert that was just earlier last year. So, and that's my daughter. She loves her picture taken. Okay, so there are 16 different nutrients that have been shown to be deficient often in patients with autism. And perhaps more importantly, there are a lot of nutrients that have been shown in large doses to be helpful in people with autism, at least by one or more studies, 8 of which I think have enough evidence to suggest that they really should be considered. How do you choose which vitamin product to use? One thing I want to mention is that when you learned it in biology and probably forgot it right after the exam, they spoke about like Krebs cycle, and you'll see this picture of the Krebs cycle. In the last lecture we saw one, or the electron transport chain. And you get the idea that there's these enzymes and they float in the water of the cell, right? And something comes to it and it changes it, and then it goes to another enzyme. That is not the way it works. The way that it works is that all of these are crystallized on the membrane into an assembly line. And why we like to think about the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle as being separate entities. They're not. In fact, they're crystallized in the same membrane and the same assembly line. This right here is what it really looks like. This is an actual photograph by an electron microscope of what the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain look like. It's a false color image, obviously. The computer changed the color so that you can see the different enzymes are the different colors. But that is the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. That's what it really looks like, is that a chemical enters on one side and it's moved, physically moved. CoQ is one of the little cranes that moves and goes from one to the other. It's physically moved from one place to another to go all the way down the line, get from one end to the other. Nothing's floating around and happen to meet something. It's like a machine. And here's the cars are made by an assembly line. Here's Ford Motor Company on the lower left. That's 100 years ago, and Hyundai today. And you can see that, that's the way to make something quickly, is to put it in a line. But the problem is let's say that guy in the middle of the line, or that machine in the middle of the line decides to make cars twice as fast because it's been supercharged with vitamins. So this guy right here, let's give him some vitamins and supercharge him. What's going to happen? Are you going to make more cars? No, you're going to have total chaos. And a lot of people come in and they say, my kid doesn't tolerate vitamins. Dr. So-and-so gave me this or gave me that. And, you're supercharging one of those guys in the line. You really need to make the whole line go faster because it is an assembly line. And so I'm a strong believer in giving a lot of nutritional products to try to move things along and not try to guess, let's do this or let's do that. So my answer to the question of, well, you showed us 8, which ones should we try first? Do them all. So I'm not the first one by any means that had that idea. The Adams studies by Dr. Jim Adams, he took 31, I think, different minerals, vitamins, and things together, and to try to fix autism, and he did double-blind placebo-controlled study, which is the best you can do. Nobody, except for the research pharmacists, knew if it was placebo or vitamin. So kids took placebo at one point, and they didn't know, and then they took the vitamin at another point, and they didn't know which one was which, and they did a bunch of studies on that. And they found, as you can see, that in the green there, that there was significant improvements in many different areas, including some core autism areas, such as receptive language and in hyperactivity and tantruming, which is really, to some degree, social, and control of your behavior, of prefrontal cortex, and executive function. There were also a bunch of biochemical changes, too, to go with that, and showed that you can make significant improvements in autism, including in core autism, if you use a multivitamin cocktail. This is Bonnie Kaplan has a similar but different formulation. And it's the same sort of thing with a bunch of different vitamins and minerals together. First of all, is that she has a lot of papers, but I just want to show 2 of them. One that is that explosive rage is improved. Some of you might have children that occasionally meet that diagnosis. It's pretty common in autism. And also tolerability. She's shown that her vitamin supplement is very highly tolerable, is that few kids have side effects. The ADAMS study also showed it was very highly tolerable. There were basically no side effects in any of these studies. There were some little tiny transient stuff, but they weren't really bigger than placebo, and no children were harmed by these. When I started going to autism doctors with my own formula, here's some of the literature, is that people, a lot of them, including some really well-known autism doctors, were like, well, that's never going to work, because when I give a vitamin or a compound to a child, a lot of times they don't tolerate it, and sometimes they really don't tolerate it at all, and they're much worse, and we have to take them off. You have, 30, 31, 33 different things together. No one's going to tolerate that. But the experience shows is that when you put it all together, it's really more highly tolerated. And I was really shocked when I started doing it myself. And for 2 years, I've been using these compounds. It's about how highly tolerable they really are. If anyone wants to talk to me after this, and hopefully we can even do some taste testing, I have a powder called 𝗂𝗵𝗲. It has 33 different ingredients in it. And it's very similar to the ADAMS and the Kaplan formula. The big difference is that there's a very high-powered mitochondrial cocktail. That at least wasn't in the ADAMS formula at the time they did that study, and it's not in the Kaplan formula. So it's pretty much the same as those, but with a high-powered mitochondrial cocktail. And then you've seen Luca before. He's the one with autism and epilepsy. And then he had clinical improvements when I put him on, kind of what I used to use as a cocktail, 10 years ago, CoQ, carnitine, the 8B vitamins, magnesium, and vitamin C. That was kind of the thing that I used. You can imagine that's kind of hard to give the different things. And then when I switched him over to 𝗂𝗵𝗲, he did have significant improvements thereafter. Everybody is a different individual, and the improvements are individualized in different ones. In Luca's case, he went from having constipation and having cleanouts in the hospital to having completely normal bowels on 𝗂𝗵𝗲. But everyone is different in terms of what it will do. He also had much decreased brain fog. So beyond this, so whether you use the ADAMS formula or the Kaplan formula or 𝗂𝗵𝗲, there are some caveats to go beyond that. In particular, CoQ. I cannot emphasize CoQ enough. There is ubiquinone, which is the less bioavailable form of CoQ in most of these formulas. And the CoQ levels do go up a little bit, but it's not enough. I always recommend to use an oil-based ubiquinol with an OL at the end on top of that to get the CoQ levels higher. I also recommend to do blood testing, particularly for CoQ, carnitine, and vitamin D, to make sure that those are in the preferred range and to give additional if needed. And then there's the fish oil. And the fish oil is not part of any of these because it doesn't mix with these type of things. So that would be another thing to consider as another product. So it would be nice to put everything so you would just take one thing. That was when I started this. I just wanted to have one pill or something that cured the world, right? But it doesn't really work that way. You really, you need to have the combination product plus more CoQ plus a omega-3 source. And then every individual is completely different. And then I use this as the baseline platform to which to build on. For example, if you have migraine, I add more magnesium and I add more riboflavin because those work great in migraine. I can give a million other examples, but I'm going to get dragged off the stage. So here I have, in addition, we have my own CoQ brand, but there are many different ubiquinol brands. And here's the main points of the presentation. I mean, I kind of went through this to some degree at the beginning, is that autism is not, I mean, it's a diagnosis in like migraine is a diagnosis, but it really is just a description, and there's many, many different biological ways that you can get there, and that everybody is an individual, and you need to figure out what the problem is to be able to fix it. If you don't know what the problem is, how can you really fix it? A lot of the fixing is nutritional. Next lecture, I will go into the genetic testing, and there are drugs and other things that you can use on various mutations. But even there, I'm going to use nutritional is, in my mind, the #1 pathway on that. And then the other thing is that there's really an assembly line, and it's really to give one thing and then to give another thing is perhaps not the best way to go about this. And then there's my information.